Hey, so I wanted to do a quick video about how I do this painting in my wine and watercolor class because it is one of my most requested classes, and it seems like a lot of people want to finish it even after class or continue to work on it. So I'm going to show you some of the basic methods and how to do this. I'm not going to talk about what types of paints or products I use. That can be for a different video. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that a person knows how to use watercolor or has them at home. I'm just going to talk about what process we use in our wine and watercolor class. Today I don't have wine. I've got my hot tea, and I'm gonna just take you guys through this process and show you what we do to do most of these watercolor processes here. These are basic techniques, and I will walk you through these. These are wet and wet techniques. And this is all wet and wet using salt, and there's a little bit of glazing that we do here as well to build up these thin transparent layers one on top of another so you get this dimension. So let me go ahead and set aside our example here, and I will show you that this is what I bring to class. It's just a basic line drawing on a piece of paper that I have my students either hold up to a window and trace, or sometimes we bring, everybody has a smartphone with a flashlight on it, it seems like these days. And so any light being projected through the back of this allows these lines to pass through the watercolor paper, so that you can see it and then trace it with a pencil. I do draw pretty heavily. I don't mind seeing the pencil lines at the end. That's a preference that you may or may not want, but I like seeing the lines. And to me, on a finished product, it doesn't matter because watercolor is so transparent, you can still see a lot of the lines and it's not bothersome. We always transfer from a piece of just computer paper to watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is much heavier. It's kind of like a stiff sponge in that it absorbs paper. It doesn't slide off the surface. It's very porous, and so it's going to soak it in so that it can stay where it's put. We don't want puddles or things like that, but it can certainly allow for a heavy amount of water to go down on top of it. So let me go ahead and get started here. And I guess I need a brush. I'm going to be using a larger brush than we do in class. This is a 12, just because I can get things done a lot faster. And like I said, we're using a basic wet in wet technique. So what we're going to be doing first, though, is laying down just a base color, something so that it's not just flat white or harsh white. And the reason is because between some of these little shapes in the turtle shell, it's just the plain paper showing through. And so I just grabbed something from the middle of my palette that's going to resemble brown, and it just happened to be orange, and then I grabbed a little bit of this kind of reddish brown, and I'm putting this on nice and wet so that it's really nice and fluid, but it's not puddling, and it's going to dry faster than if I were to lay it down very heavily. Now, one thing about watercolor is that it always dries a little bit lighter than it looks when it's wet. And so you might actually scare yourself with some bright colors. But that's okay, because when they dry, they will just be a little bit less aggressive. And sometimes that means that you need to be a little heavier handed when you're applying your first coats of color. Now, I'm not going to add any pigment to this right now, because if I started to try and draw paint inside these little shapes, they would bleed. Well, I say watercolor is no respecter of pencil lines. It's not going to stay where I put it if other areas around it are wet. It will move to wherever it is wet. So instead, what I'm going to do is now move outside to this water here, and I'm going to just be doing this shape at first, and then I'll come over here and do this larger shape. And don't forget about this one here behind his flipper. And because this is tropical water, we're going to go for something that is a little bit more of a blue-green. So I can either mix my own blue-green, just using blue and green, or I can use this turquoise that I already have here in my palette. But I am going to get my green wet as well, both of my greens, because maybe I want to drop in a little bit of variation so it's not just all flat. And I'm going to do the same with my other two blues that I have. I have ultramarine here and Cad Blue, which is just a basic blue. This is Sap Green, and I think this is maybe Hooker's Green, actually, is what that one's called that I'm using. You could also do this with yellow. Put yellow in your blue, and of course blue plus yellow is green. But I don't want it to be that aggressive of a green. So instead of adding yellow, I'm just going to stick with adding green to my blue in a couple areas. And I'll show you that in just a minute. And what I'm doing right now is just with clean water, I'm painting over this entire area here. And because my first wash right here was pretty thin, I know that it's not going to bleed, and it's also very, very light. And so even if this brown bled into where I'm doing this water, it wouldn't show up. And then conversely, if blue bleeds back into a wet area on the brown, I don't actually mind, because there is a lot of that on the original anyway, and I tend to paint a little bit more loose. And I kind of like it when things bleed. It makes it look a little bit more spontaneous, I think. But that is just a style as well. So here's my turquoise. This literally is called turquoise. Straight out of the tube. I didn't mix it with anything. And my bigger brush allows this part to work a little bit faster. I'm going back to my Cad Blue, or my, you know, it's like a true blue. Dropping that into a couple different areas. And then my ultramarine, it kind of has a little bit of a purple in it. It's a little bit cooler. I don't want to overuse that. And I'll show you as well how to get greens in there. Now when I'm adding a color into a wet and wet, this is very wet by the way. When I'm adding a color into wet and wet, I have a couple different options. I can place it right next to what I've already done, or I can mix it. I can mix it on my palette, or I can mix it on the paper. Right now I'm just gonna go ahead and mix it a little bit on the paper, because I don't want striped water. I just want, I mean, really in real life, if this were flowing and fluid, then, you know, we probably wouldn't have splotches of water. It's way more subtle than that. So let me go ahead and get a little bit more green in there. Now, I would probably, instead of, this is one way that you can mix colors, is by mixing on your paper where it's wet, or you can mix the two colors here on your palette so that when you put it here, they're already mixed together. There are two different options, and I'm doing both here so that you can see that. And you know what, right now I'm also going to go ahead and do this. Let me just show you. I didn't wet this area, but it's really small, and so it's, if I just keep my paint really nice and wet, it can have that same effect, especially since I do have the benefit of using a larger brush. And that's bleeding right there. That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and leave it. Let me grab my salt, which of course I forgot. It should be somewhere around here. If not, I'll edit the picture. There it is. No need to edit the video, rather, not the picture. So I just am using regular table salt. If you have larger grain salt is going to create larger little crystallizations on your picture. If you have smaller grains, you run the risk of having it be dissolved faster and not creating grains at all. Another possibility, if it's going to dissolve too quickly, a chance that it would dissolve too quickly, is if it's too wet, like it was here on this original. This is too wet. And if it's too dry, it also will not be able to have the same effect. Now what the salt does is it absorbs water, and because it absorbs the water, the paint also comes with it. So every little grain is sucking up all of the water and pigment around it, and then it stays and dries inside the granule of salt, and you can brush the salt off once it's done. You'll see the salt also becomes blue, and then everywhere that it has sucked up all of that pigment looks like a little white crystallization. And so here in this wet area, I'll go ahead and do my salt. And then, you know, let's see, one right there. And you can experiment using different size granules. That's actually puddling. It's becoming a lower point and it's darker, so that might in fact not show any of those granules. It might just dissolve and not show up later. But now I'm going to go ahead and move up and do this section. Really, you want your water to be as clean as possible when you're doing a wet and wet. But here it's okay. It's not that dark. I've got this water has already turned a little bit blue, or my brush isn't all the way clean. But in this case, it's just light enough that it doesn't matter, especially since I'm just using the same color. I might want a little more variation up here. In my color. So I'll add a little bit more green, a little bit more blue and green. We'll see what that does. And it continues to move, and so much about watercolor is a letting go of control. You can't really control it the way that you think you can or the way that you might want to. And that spontaneity is what is unique to watercolor because it's not necessarily controlled. It ends up being a lot more beautiful than if we were to try to control it on our own. Isn't that so true of our own lives? If we can just give up control in our lives, there's often a plan. There's always a plan that's better than if we were to try to do it on our own. So I do see that down here, the salt that I added down there has already dissolved. That's okay. This is really just a grand experiment. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. We definitely don't want to over salt it. It still can dissolve if you over salt it. And then it really actually kind of flattens out your color. But I'll add some more right there anyway. Okay, so there's actually the background. And next we will be doing the technique, which is the shell on the turtle.